Alright guys, this is our lecture on primary producers. Hopefully you have your marine biology book out while you're listening to this lecture. It's chapter 2. So I'm going to grab that real quick and get started. So we have two main primary producers in a marine environment. We have bacterioplankton and phytoplankton. So our phytoplankton here is on the bottom. You can see there we have a copepod. Looks like there's some diatoms in there. And then over here on the right, those are bacterioplankton. They're single-celled prokaryotic organisms. So bacterioplankton represent about 30 to 50% of the primary productivity in the ocean because bacteria can be photosynthetic. Cyanobacteria is the most productive bacteria in this group, which you can also call blue-green algae. There's a lot we still don't know about these types of producers, but we do know that they are one of the most productive groups. They're prokaryotic and single-celled. Prokaryotic just means that it's a single-celled organism without a nucleus, and it doesn't have any specialized organelles, and bacteria fall into that group. So our second one is phytoplankton, and these single-celled organisms, there are quite a few different types. We've got diatoms, copepods, dinoflagellates, algae, single-celled algae. So diatoms are really important because they have this encapsulated like mesh that they make that's made of, is really kind of similar to like a glass-like structure, and they form chains called colonies, and when they die, all of the silicate filters down to the bottom of the ocean, and that's actually part of the sediment, like marine sediment. And we also use them extensively in parts of our economy: toothpaste, dog food, filters for like refrigerators, and pest control. So diatomaceous earth, if you ever heard of that, that's made up of diatoms and silicate that is part of those diatoms. So dinoflagellates, we call them dinoflagellates because they have a flagellum. The flagellum helps them swim. They're made up of cellulose, and they can cause disease. The red tide, if you've ever heard of that, is a dinoflagellate, and it's actually toxic and cause death. And then we also have coccolithophores, which are covered with these small little plates you can see right here. They're very intricate, but they're made up of calcium carbonate. And they're also responsible for chalk deposits on the ocean floor. And when these chalk deposits are uplifted from the bottom of the ocean through upwellings, like when we talked about when we did physical oceanography, we use them in industrial products. They both use photosynthesis, phytoplankton and bacterioplankton. So we talked about bacterioplankton has the blue-green algae, the cyanobacteria, which is photosynthetic. And here's our formula for photosynthesis. It's 6 carbon dioxides plus 6 water. Add in sunlight, and then you get C6H12O6, which is glucose, and oxygen. And oxygen is really important because that's what animals use to have to do cellular respiration to get ATP. These bacteria and phytoplankton are in the first trophic level of our global ocean system, so they're really, really important because they really make up the base of the entire marine food web. The rate of photosynthesis is going to decrease with depth, just because the deeper it gets, the darker it gets, less sunlight that filters through. So at about the critical depth, which is about 2,000 meters, that's where phytoplankton are going to become less productive, so they need to stay above that. When we did our Great Plankton races, that's basically what you were trying to do, is make sure that they didn't get below that 2,000 meter, because then they would die and they can't photosynthesize, and then they can't become part of the food chain very slowly, so that they can photosynthesize as much as possible. So there are other nutrients, non-organic nutrients, in a marine ecosystem or marine systems, and the most important ones are nitrogen, phosphorus, and iron. And they're all used by those primary. So nitrogen is really important because we have these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, which give us these natural sources of nitrogen and nitrates for organisms. And they're also able to fix that nitrogen directly from seawater in those inorganic compounds, which is very interesting. We didn't know that they could do that, and we just assumed that nitrogen was an unusable, this source of inorganic nitrogen in the ocean was something that these organisms couldn't use. But we're understanding our ocean more and more, and understand that these bacteria are actually able to take in these nitrogen, inorganic nitrogen pieces, basically, and incorporate them and use them. So when these bacteria die, then they re-release the nitrogen back in the water. So it's that nitrogen cycle. We know that it's very much like the water cycle, where all the nitrogen that's on our planet is all the nitrogen we're ever going to have, and it's just in a cycle, and it keeps getting reused in our system. Okay. So if the bacteria get eaten, then that nitrogen can be incorporated into whatever organism has eaten that bacteria. Okay, so phosphorus is another one of those really important elements. And this phosphorus gets into the water by erosion of rocks on land. So we talked about sedimentation and how we get a lot of some of the salt components into our water when we did physical oceanography. We can also get phosphorus in that way. So the water from streams and rivers contains that dissolved rock, and then it's then transported to the ocean, where the phosphorus is deposited and then used by these bacterioplankton. Okay, and then the last one we'll talk about is iron. So iron is a micronutrient, so they only need it in small amounts, but it's still really essential. It comes from iron-rich dust that is blown from deserts during the storms. So it really is dependent on whether we get iron into our system, into this marine system. Since iron concentrations are low because of that, it can be the limiting factor in a nutrient system. So that means that there can be a lot of phosphorus, there can be a lot of nitrogen in a system, but nothing can really grow unless it also has that iron. So you can have these areas called high nutrient, low chlorophyll regions, which means that there's a lot of nitrogen, a lot of phosphorus, but these organisms can't incorporate it because their limiting factor is iron, and that system is either deficient or low in iron. So organisms can't thrive if they have an inadequate amount of iron. So these are really interesting to researchers, because what these researchers want to do is increase the bloom of algal blooms and plankton, because then they can suck up more carbon dioxide, because that's basically what they do with photosynthesis. They suck up carbon dioxide and then they release oxygen. And by stimulating these blooms, and we can decrease the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. So their proposal is that we fertilize these HNLC areas with iron so that we can encourage blooms. However, what we want to encourage is diatom blooms, because other organisms don't really favor eating diatoms as much as like other things like dinoflagellates and cyanobacteria and things like that. So they'll live longer, which means that they can suck up more carbon dioxide. But it's hard for us to, like, we can't just say, okay, hey diatoms, you start growing now because we fertilized you with iron. It doesn't really work that way. So there's still that research that needs to be done to try and figure out what specifically do we need to do to get the diatoms to bloom but not the others. So that's another really important thing. It's also unclear whether it would be worth the cost. So if you see over here, we have this wooden sunken ship here, and there's really not much going on around it. But then we have this metal sunken ship, and you can see there's a lionfish here. You can see all of these other organisms in the background, and that's because this metal is iron, and so it's releasing iron into these regions, which it can be a limiting nutrient, so you can have more life in that area. So when we're looking at primary productivity and we're trying to figure out how much primary productivity is actually going on, there are a couple methods we can do. The light and dark bottle method, which is here on the bottom. We can use the carbon-14 method, and we can do satellite-derived measures, which is what we do these days. So you can see over here, we've got dissolved oxygen. So when we have a light bottle, it's obviously performing photosynthesis, but if it's dark, which is like over here, then it has to do respiration, because that's the only thing it can do in dark. Okay, so we take the initial and the light and the dark, find the net productivity of the photosynthesis, find the net productivity of respiration, and then that's your gross productivity. And that's your light and dark bottle method. Now with carbon-14, what we do is we actually feed carbon-14 to these organisms, and as they die, the carbon-12 that's in their system is how much net productivity there is. And then satellite-derived measures, that's where we look at the blooms from space. So we just look at how much green is there. And we can look at it over time to see where the blooms are actually occurring. So when we do patterns of productivity and we have tropical, subpolar, temperate, and coastal upwellings. So you can see that they're all kind of have a different productivity rate, time of year, and that's really dependent upon the region of the latitude. So we know that the latitude of a tropical ocean is going to be different than the latitude of a subpolar ocean. So really it depends on how much sunlight and solar activity the regions are getting. So with polar productivity, they're going to have a high productivity due to this continuous solar radiation in the summer. So you know that if you live in Alaska, you get like 6 months of summer, right? Close to it. And it's light all the time, and then it's dark for a really long time. So when it's light and you have this continuous solar radiation in the summer, you're going to have a high productivity because it's continuous. And they are also going to lack a thermocline because if the temperature of the water is the same at the top as it is at the bottom, then there's no thermocline, because we know that the thermocline is where the ocean has the greatest temperature change and it becomes constant. But there's no thermocline if the temperature at the top and the bottom is the same. So this nutrient cycle, when it becomes depleted, it just sinks to the bottom, and the stuff at the bottom sinks or comes to the top because there's no barrier, there's no thermocline. So in tropical productivity, these are also known as ocean deserts, which seems kind of silly because on land we know that tropical areas actually have the highest biodiversity, but if we look in the ocean, it's not the same. And it's because there's a permanent thermocline there. When you have a 30 degrees Celsius top and a 4 degrees Celsius bottom, you have that really prominent permanent thermocline. And so it's like a barrier, and things can't get down, and well, things get down, but things can't get back up. So once the nutrients are depleted at the top and they sink down as ocean snow, they can't come back up. So they can be like oceanic deserts. Okay. These are where you're going to find your HNLC areas in these tropical areas because they're going to be low in iron, but they can be high in nitrogen and phosphorus. So you're going to have these high nutrient, low chlorophyll areas, and they're going to happen here. So when we look at temperate, this is just all the other places. It's going to be linked to your seasonal events, whether it's spring, fall, winter, summer. Okay, and in winter, this thermocline is going to break down because the water becomes more. Okay, so as I was saying, these primary productivity areas in temperate are linked to these seasonal events. In the winter, the thermocline is going to break down because the water becomes colder on the top, and so then that's when you're going to have these winter upwelling events where nutrients are able to come to the top because that permanent thermocline, which is actually a temporary thermocline in this area, breaks down and is able to recycle nutrients. And then in the summer, we don't have a whole lot of mixing in nutrient mixing because you get that permanent temporary thermocline. Now, coastal productivity is going to have the highest amount of productivity because of something we call the Ekman spiral. So this is where you're going to get your upwellings because of the Ekman spiral, and the wind is going to act in concert with the Coriolis effect. So as the Earth is turning and the wind is blowing, the Coriolis effect still moves the water, okay, but the wind is blowing in an opposite direction, so it actually makes it to where it's parallel. And I'm going to show you a quick video on that. But the seawater is going to curl to a 90-degree angle and to the shore due to this Coriolis effect. It's called the Ekman spiral, and then the movement of that water is actually called the Ekman transport. So here's a little picture of it. You can see the wind, and as the Earth turns here, then it's going to make it into a spiral, and that net water transport is going to go at a 90-degree angle to the shore. So here's our little video. Maybe. Oops. Okay, so that was a nice little video on Ekman transport. So hopefully you got something out of that. It was a little bit more concise than what I was going to say, so I had nice little music. So let's talk about El Nino. El Nino, or ENSO, is really an interesting phenomenon that we don't really understand very well. But it creates these really warm ocean conditions off the coast of South America, which can cause fisheries to crash because the water is actually so warm that it can actually deplete the amount of dissolved oxygen and crash the anchovy fishery, which a lot of marine organisms depend on. But this is caused by a reverse oscillation, which means the direction in which the air is flowing reverses. And it's going to cause these trade winds to die down because there are constant trade winds, subtropical and upper tropical areas. But it causes them to die down, and then it allows this warm water that's above it to come down and actually increase the temperature of that water. And then it accumulates along the coast, which depresses the upwelling that's there in that area because of the trade winds. But when that upwelling dies down, all the nutrients that are coming up from the bottom of the ocean, like the iron and the nitrogen and the phosphorus, and all of the things that are coming up from the bottom of the ocean stop. And so that means that not only is the water warm depleted of oxygen, but it's also devoid of nutrients, which makes the anchovy fishery crash, which then in turn makes either the marine mammals in the area die if they cannot move to a different feeding ground, or they move off to different feeding grounds. This isn't only just bad for marine mammals, but also for humans, because a lot of humans actually depend on the anchovy fishery. So this El Nino is just a really important phenomenon to understand. Now, nobody really understands it fully. So it's just important to understand that this is a reverse oscillation that creates warm water off the coast of South America. But not only that, but it also can create lots of rain in other areas because of this reverse oscillation. So all the rain that would normally be in South America goes up to the coast of Lake California, and then all the rain that would normally be in South America and like Australia isn't there at all, and so it can cause drought conditions. So it can cause floods in some areas and droughts in others, causes warm water and anchovy fisheries to crash. So really it's just not a good thing all around. Sometimes it's good for Utah though, because we get a lot of water, which then turns into snow, which means we have a runoff, but there are very rare places where El Nino is actually a good thing. So the last couple things we're going to talk about is just the movement of energy through a food web. So we know that energy moves through a food web. We start at the bottom, goes to the top. Now only about 10% of the energy from one level goes to the next. And most of that's lost as heat, as excess energy, and things like that. But large diatoms, dinoflagellates, bacteria, plankton, phytoplankton, these are all the base of our food web. And then those major grazers, the primary consumers are going to be copepods. Okay, and if you look in your book, there is a picture of a copepod, and you can kind of look at the, see if I can, you can look at the little appendages in how they eat, but they're just the primary grazers in a marine food web. And then they in turn are eaten by other things, and so they're kind of the primary grazers. But coastal areas have this really short and efficient food web and can be exploited by humans because it's such a short and efficient food web. But we talked about how only a quarter of the energy is transferred to the next food level. And oceans contain a high percentage of dissolved organic matter, which we also call DOM. Okay, and most of this DOM is actually leaked into the ocean from viruses, which are the most abundant thing in the ocean, which is kind of a shocker. But there are so many viruses that as they break other things down or as they die, they leak dissolved organic matter into the water, which then can be directly incorporated into phytoplankton and bacterial plankton. So I kind of reiterated it here when we talked about the microbial loop, is that dissolved organic matter is leaked from cells breaking down after infected by a virus, okay, and then it can be absorbed directly into bacterial plankton, and then they are eaten in turn, and then those are eaten by copepods, and then the copepods are eaten by fish, zooplankton, okay, and then DOM is recycled back into the ocean by the death of copepods, bacterial plankton, or larger animals, organisms. So that's our microbial loop. Because our microbes are DOM and bacteria. Okay, so the detritus food chain, detritus just means dead and decaying material, like fecal pellets from zooplankton, like copepods, and the death of phyto and zooplankton can create this massive amount of particulate organic matter. So that's different than dissolved, because this is actually, like, a good example of this would be like ocean snow. That's particulate organic matter. This is going to start the base of the detritus food chain. So this ocean snow is the base of your detritus food chain because it is the detritus. And then the remainder of the particulate organic matter that isn't consumed by other organisms that filter them through, they go down to the bottom, and then they provide nutrients for demersal creatures, and demersal just means bottom dwelling. So you can kind of see our detritus food chain here. So you've got your decomposer organisms, which will float down as ocean snow and actually become permanently incorporated into sediment, or they can be eaten by soil animals like worms, platyhelminths, nematodes, which then are in turn consumed by small carnivorous organisms. All right, so that's the end of our PowerPoint for today.